And we have another nice start to the afternoon. We have one of the other organisers of today's event, co-organiser, in the form of Ron Halliday. Those of you who've been to these events before will have seen Ron speak many times and know that we're in for an excellent performance as well. Ron Halliday is the author of several books on strange phenomena, including UFO Scotland, Scotland's X-Files, Paranormal Scotland, Alien Spirits, and Famous Scots and the Supernatural. He has appeared on radio and television, including BBC Newsnight. For several years, he wrote the X-Files column for the Glasgow Evening Times. But he's here this afternoon to talk to us about bizarre mysteries of the sea. So, ladies and gentlemen, Ron Halliday.
Okay, jolly good. I'd like to welcome everybody to this afternoon session of the UFO and Paranormal Conference. It's been great to see so many familiar faces here and new people as well, and have a chat about all things paranormal. Sorry, I'll just get rid of that. You know, I've had a long time interest in the supernatural, the paranormal, and I've always found there's something new, interesting to talk about and investigate. And this is something that I have been interested in, but only recently took back up again. What first aroused my interest was reading this book by John Wyndham, The Kraken Awakes. It's probably better known for books like The Midwich Cuckoos and The Day of the Triffids, which have been made into films and TV series. But this particular book, as you can see, is about some giant sea monster that comes up and attacks the ship. Oops. There we go. And, you know, I got interested because I thought, well, is that feasible? I mean, could there really be monsters there in the sea or in the oceans? And the thing is that so much of the earth is actually covered by water. Roughly 71% is underwater, a vast area. And people have said, oops, I'll go back, you know, that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the oceans and what's down there, which I think is obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but I think it does convey that idea. You know, there's a lot in the water and all these seas that we don't know anything about. And I will compare it because that's a picture of Loch Ness. Some of you might identify it quite easily, but, you know, people talk about a monster being in Loch Ness as a real animal. You know, I know that even people here today are, you know, planning to do more investigation to see if they can discover this particular animal. And we can dispute about whether there's something real there or whether it's somebody's imagination. But I will point out, Loch Ness monster supposedly lives in a loch 23 miles long. Sorry, I was brought up in feet and inches and miles, and so, you know, I got taught a bit of the metric system, but it just confused me a bit. But anyway, I put in 227 metres deep, or 744 feet. But compare that to the Pacific Ocean, which stretches from 9,600 miles and is over 36,000 feet at its deepest point, which is the Mariana Trench, which is actually, you know, deeper down than Mount Everest is tall by several thousand feet. So if we actually say, well, there could be a monster in Loch Ness, well, you might say, well, what else is there in these oceans that stretch right across the world? And there have been, for centuries, there's been claims about monsters being there. I mean, as far back as 1743, Hans Egede, I think he's called, he was actually a minister, but he was out exploring the area around Greenland, and he spotted a monster. And in 1848, the Illustrated London News published a picture of a monster, and this was the kind of monster that they were talking about, which actually looked like a giant sea serpent, if you like. A bit like, in some ways, what people have said in the Loch Ness monster, but actually a lot bigger. And that idea of the monster, you know, it's gone on, and there, a recent picture, once again, a slightly different type of monster, but, you know, this belief that there could be something down there, something strange, has carried on right into recent times. It's actually been experienced round the coast of Scotland up to fairly recent times. Just, you know, I know most people know Scotland, but there might be some people here, you know, from down south who's not quite clear what Scotland looks like. And the coastline of Scotland is around about 3,000 miles, and I did check this out, which is nearly 5,000 kilometres long. So, you know, it's quite a big area round about. And there's been a whole series. I've just quickly jotted down some. I'm not going to read through them all. But it just gives you some idea about how frequent these monster sightings around the coast of Scotland had been. And some of them are quite hard to believe. You know, September 1891, a 300-foot monster. And then there's another one, somebody actually fired a gun at a monster they thought was attacking the ship. And right up to 1935, when an alleged monster was washed up on Girvan Beach down in Irvine. Dispute about was it just a basking shark that deteriorated. But I mean, there have been all these claims about monster sightings down the coast of Scotland. And then was a submarine sunk by a sea monster. This actually stretches back, you know, to the First World War, when a captain of the UB-85 plane had been on the surface recharging batteries for the ship at night, and a strange creature suddenly attacked the submarine. And he described the creature having large eyes set in a horny sort of skull, had a small head, teeth that could be glistening in the moonlight. And UB-85 did exist. There's a picture of it. And there's a picture of it sunk off the coast of Galloway, between Galloway and Northern Ireland. So we know it actually did exist. But needless to say, there's been a lot of controversy about this. You know, did the submarine captain actually claim this? Was this something that was invented by somebody for the internet? There's been two different views of it. And I know a chap who did investigate it, you know, said, well, he never said that he'd been attacked by a monster. But all I'm trying to convey is this idea, you know, that the theme of the monster in the ocean is actually carrying on right up until fairly recent times. So, a monster attacking a submarine. What about strange vanishings that occur? I mean, you get these on the seas, and I'll come back to that in a little while. We'll also get it in connection with islands. This was, at the time, quite a famous incident. Some of you might recall it, back in July 1990. Aynhoe is a small island off the coast of Orkney. You're allowed to visit it once a year, and on the 14th of July 1990, a ship took a party of 88 people to visit this island, just a kind of nature reserve. Of course, they had to count the people on board, so they counted on 88 people, dropped them off at the island, and then came back to pick them up. Picked them up, went back to the port to let them off, and discovered that there was only 86 people on board. So immediately, of course, there was a panic. And it became absolutely phenomenal in terms of the newspaper and media interest. The police were alerted, the Coast Guard were alerted, there was a complete search of the island. And then it extended beyond that. Were these two tourists from abroad nobody knew about? So it became an international investigation. And nobody ever tracked down these two people. So it then became a question of, well, had there been a miscount? And the captain and the crew insisted they hadn't miscounted. So two people had disappeared. And the thing is, why I mention this is because this particular island had a reputation as what you call a vanishing island, a supernatural island, you know, which suddenly appeared and then it would disappear at periods of the year. So it had this reputation as a kind of supernatural place. So what had happened? The two people actually vanished into another dimension. And in connection with that, another famous vanishing, which I'm sure everybody's heard about, which they've even made a film about recently, the Llanel's Lighthouse, which essentially, the essential story concerns, 4 lighthouse keepers. They took it in turns, 3 at a time, to man the lighthouse, and then on rotation, 1 person would leave. So anyway, the lighthouse keeper who was on leave, he came back on 26th of December, the day after Christmas, obviously. And when he arrived there, he searched the lighthouse, and there was no sign of his other 3 lighthouse keepers. They'd simply disappeared. And the whole place looked tidy. There was no obvious explanation as to what had happened to them. There was no blood on the floor, because, 3 lighthouse keepers spending all that time locked together, well, you can imagine, it get a bit frustrating. They could start fighting, but there's no evidence of that. So what had happened to them? And all kinds of theories were put forward. That they'd gone down to the jetty and got washed away by a giant wave. That was one reasonable explanation. Other explanations were a bit more extreme, that they'd actually been knocked off by a giant sea monster. And then as, the time progressed, it became more, well, had they been abducted by a UFO? Had the aliens landed? Had they walked into another dimension? So there were all these possibilities as to what might have happened. And again, the Flannan Isles had this reputation as a kind of ghostly island, where strange things might have happened. So again, in connection with the sea, vanishings taking place. And that is a theme that, does occur from time to time. Sorry, there's a picture of an island lighthouse. Recent one, obviously. And so, from the vanishings on these islands, the vanishings out in the seas, the Bermuda Triangle, which has become one of these enduring mysteries which, as I'm sure you know, endless books and articles have been written about, endless films and documentaries. It all started off in 1945. This was the incident that really got the whole story going, if you like. When 5 Avenger torpedo bombers and their crew just disappeared. Did they go into another dimension? Is there a more straightforward explanation? Well, we have to take this into consideration with a lot of other strange incidents that have taken place in the Bermuda Triangle, which, as some said, is just an arbitrary kind of area, what about everywhere else in the world? Which is a fair point, but there have been a lot of strange incidents in it. And that is the so-called Bermuda Triangle. You can see where it is from the Florida coast out to a dot in the ocean, down towards the Caribbean. Here's a picture of the, I don't think it's the exact torpedo bombers, obviously, but of the type of torpedo bomber that did go missing. There were three members of a crew in each plane. And again, you get some dispute about, well, were these 3 inexperienced people? Were these 3 experienced people? And you can get different versions of who they were and who was more experienced or who was in charge, and you get a whole range of discussion about it. But it does seem as if they were experienced pilots just going out for a traditional, if you like, flyabouts to carry on the kind of manoeuvres that pilots do to keep their skills up. Flight 19 left Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station 2 p.m. on 5th December 1945. It was scheduled to fly for 2 hours, which is like the traditional kind of flight time for these sort of maneuvers. 3:35, which is 1.5 hours roughly into the flight, they radioed that they were lost. And this kind of perplexed the people receiving these messages. I mean, how had they got lost flying in this area where people were used to flying? It was a well, navigated area. But what was wrong? The last message was received at 4:25, where they guessed they must have run out of fuel because they were scheduled to fly for a maximum of 2 hours. But the messages that were received back at the base indicated that they just could not, not only did they not know where they were, but the whole area where they were flying over, if you like, was changing. They couldn't see where the sea was, and the sky above them seemed quite peculiar. And there was strange things happening to the instruments on the aeroplanes. And it's weird that, all the planes would be affected in this same way. You think 5 planes, some of the crew on those planes would be able to find this, make sure they knew where they were and return to base. But they didn't. They disappeared, and despite, I don't know if you follow the story, but despite various claims that the planes have been found deep down, they've never actually found the planes that disappeared. They found other planes, which shows that planes did crash there. Skeptics say, well, planes do crash, don't they? They crash in the water. But what was so strange about this was the messages that were being sent back, which said things about them were weird and strange. They couldn't actually discover exactly where they were. And they were flying around, for over 2 hours, and they couldn't locate any land. Somebody said, well, why didn't they look at the sun? You can decide which way you're going by finding the sun, but they couldn't see the sun because the whole of the sky was strange and weird. But this was the incident that sparked off the interest, and if you like, which created this whole story of the Bermuda Triangle. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Yeah, so I mean, that became wrapped up with this whole thing, right? Bermuda Triangle is not just the air, it's the seas. Maybe it's the sea, something in the sea that's causing all these problems. Here's some kind of imaginative depiction of what could be plane crashing into what you can see as a kind of giant void in the water, ship coming along, because ship disappearance is put down to, wow, maybe there's something there in the sea which is pulling the ships down, some supernatural type of force, maybe pulling ships down or simply making them disappear. So the same thing that was affecting planes is affecting ships. And if you go on the internet, you'll find a big long list, apart from the planes that have disappeared, you'll find a big long list of ships of all descriptions, big and small, that have simply vanished. And here's another story. I got off the internet because I was just curious as to what they were saying. Supposedly a ship that disappeared 100 years ago, then suddenly turned up, wrecked somewhere. So this is the kind of stories that was associated with it. With the Bermuda Triangle, kind of supernatural, but at the same time, could there be an ordinary explanation for it? And I think that's what's so interesting about some of these events, that, you can see where there might be natural explanations, but also there's that possibility we're dealing with something that is supernatural. The Mary Celeste, another strange event. Some say was connected to the Bermuda Triangle well before there was the idea of a Bermuda Triangle, although it didn't actually happen within the modern day parameters of the so-called Bermuda Triangle. I know it's quite a well-known story, and that is a genuine picture of the Mary Celeste, and the captain, Benjamin Briggs, he took on board his wife and his child for this sailing across the Atlantic. Just go back a minute. And this was the route that was supposed to be taken, heading out from New York towards, we were going to Genoa, carrying a cargo of crude alcohol, I'm not exactly sure what it was, but anyway, they called it crude alcohol. And near the Azores, the ship was found floating with no one on board. So I left New York on 7th November 1872, seen drifting on 4th December 1872, 600 miles from land. The last log was on 25th December, or 25th November. And these were the people involved, and the part of it which caused such controversy. That chap is John Moorhouse. He was captain of the ship, died by Gracia, and that's a kind of like an imaginative description of him spotting the Mary Celeste. So they saw the ship drifting, the Mary Celeste drifting on the sea. They sent out a boat, obviously, to investigate. When they got there, they discovered the ship was completely empty. No one on board. There's no obvious sign of serious damage. There's some water down in the, below the decks. But I mean, the pump was working and they pumped out the water in no time at all. There's no sign of any blood. Didn't look like anybody had been murdered. And there seemed no obvious reason why the ship had been abandoned. Certainly there was a lifeboat or a boat missing. So, they suggest, well, maybe they had abandoned ship, but why had they abandoned ship? There was seemed no obvious reason, why that would happen. As I said, they travelled all this way. This discussion, well, had there been stormy weather? Well, you're crossing the Atlantic, there's always going to be a bit of stormy weather. They had an experienced crew. It was a small crew, but then it wasn't a particularly big ship. There was 7 of a crew, plus the captain and the captain's wife and son. And so people said, well, would it be reasonable to expect that the captain would take all the crew off, plus his wife and child, risk in the waters if it was stormy? I mean, it seemed unreasonable to take that kind of action. You think you'd stay on the boat and hope that it would get through the storm. And anyway, was there stormy weather? The discussion about it, and it didn't seem particularly rough. So what had happened? Of course, it was suggested John Moorhouse and crew were responsible, that they'd gone on board the ship, thrown them overboard or murdered them or something, simply to get the ship, because obviously the ship, if you have salvaged the ship, you got paid, and the value of Mary Celeste, again, we can discuss all this about how much it was worth, but a figure of 17,000 was quoted for that particular time, which you can multiply by several figures to get the true value of the salvage. And of course, you get the salvage money, and it would be big for each of the members of the crew and the Di Gracia. And there was a big long investigation about it. They came under suspicion of murder, but there was absolutely no evidence that anybody had been killed there. There was no evidence that anything strange had happened, to make people abandon the ship. There was discussion about the crude alcohol on board, could it have exploded, but it was all well sealed, and there was no obvious explanation, natural explanation for it. So of course people started speculating, well, had there been some kind of vanishing event, like Flannan Island, like what happened on Einhell? People had simply disappeared, as had happened in the Bermuda Triangle. I put there Mary Celeste versus Flannan Island and Einhell. Of course, 2 disappearances happened on land. One definitely happened on the water. But can we connect them all up? Is there some kind of supernatural force or peculiar force or strange force we don't understand, which actually, comes off the ocean, comes off the seas, and generates some kind of force, or even opens up into another dimension? Is there any difference between people being abducted by alien entities or people vanishing when they're out to sea, or on land, yeah, I mean, obviously there's a similarity. But again, you could have a natural explanation. Just in brief mention again, phenomenon associated with the sea. There's mermaids, of course. People see mermaids up until comparatively recent times. But if anybody's heard seals making a noise, you'll understand, they sound like people. They do sound like people singing. I've experienced it myself, walking along by the Firth of Forth. But if you get ghost trains, ghost cars, ghost this, ghost that, then, you can get those ships as well, with all kinds of strange tales associated with them, like the Flying Dutchman. However, I come on to something which I got involved in a massive controversy about through absolutely no intention. When the Titanic film came out, as Gord mentioned, I used to write for the Glasgow Evening Times. The editor then of the features column said, "Why don't you is there anything you can do on the Titanic?" I said, "Well, I've always had a long interest in the sinking of the Titanic, because I've always been curious about, was it sunk by an iceberg? Was there any other explanation?" And because the Titanic, was the biggest ship of its time, dwarfed these days by, you see the Titanic these days compared to a picture of a modern cruise ship, it's like comparing a yacht to a liner. I mean, just looks tiny. There it is with its famous 4 funnels. And again, I'm sure the story is pretty well known, but the Titanic set off from Southampton, didn't start in Southampton, just set off on its cruise journey from Southampton and sunk a few hundred miles off the coast of New York, supposedly by an iceberg. So when I was asked to write this article, I wrote this article and made the point, queries about it being sunk by an iceberg, which I'll come to in a minute. And the reaction I got was just like unbelievably hostile. I never met such hostility for anything I wrote, because people seem to actually resent the fact that you suggested that the Titanic wasn't sunk by an iceberg, as if it was something absolutely unbelievable at that time. So I got slated in various bits and pieces across the world. Somebody even claimed that I must have been drunk before I wrote it, but, unfortunately that wasn't the case. So the conventional explanation, the Titanic was sunk by a collision with a huge iceberg. But is that the whole story? I would say no. Basic details: the Titanic sailed from Southampton Wednesday 10th April 1912, bound for New York, 7-day voyage, foundered Sunday 15th at 11:45 p.m. and into the following day. It took a while to sink. Sorry, there's a picture of an iceberg. I'm sure you all know what an iceberg looked like, but sometimes, these things are absolutely gigantic, and that is a gigantic iceberg, as you can see, so, yeah. You're not good, you think, okay, what is this man going on about, we could not possibly miss an iceberg. And this is the kind of picture I grew up with. I don't know if, well, I'm sure most of you are too young to remember the film A Night to Remember with Kenneth Moore in and the usual sort of round of English actors with cut glass voices kind of thing. And this is the image you got, because I remember it vividly. There's a Titanic sailing along, and ahead of it there's this huge white object. I think, well, how on earth could they possibly have missed that? Well, obviously, it looks good, but obviously it's not the truth, because, an iceberg's white. It looks white because it's reflecting light. When you're going along in the dark, it isn't white. It's black, basically, or very, very dark, And when the Titanic sunk that night, it was a moonless night, the stars about, it was a clear night, but, the iceberg would not be white, it would be dark. That was the first query I had, how could they be absolutely sure they were heading towards an iceberg? And I can think this is partly psychology, because they've been told, look out for icebergs, There's going to be icebergs. There's icebergs about. So yeah, they thought, well, they saw large objects ahead. Well, it's going to be an iceberg. Sorry, I will read this out. I mean, I've got a bit of text, and I apologise for it, but I mean, just to actually make these points about it. I'll come back to some other bits in a minute. But this is Peter Stevenson, a man who spent years analysing the Titanic disaster. He says there are still questions, basic questions that need to be answered about the ship. We really don't understand the character of the collision with the iceberg. We don't even know if you hit along the starboard side, as is shown in the movies. You might have grounded on the iceberg. So, I mean, even among those who maybe accept the conventional explanation, there are real doubts about what actually happened. It does seem incredible because, you get this story, we absolutely know what happened to the Titanic, but, we don't. There are a lot of queries about it. And again, sorry, I'll read this out. It looks more than it is, but I'll just quickly read it, just to give, some idea that might raise some doubts about what actually happened. This is one eyewitness statement. Somebody on the ship, obviously. There came what seemed nothing more than an extra heave of the engines and a more than usually obvious motion of the mattress on which I sat. Nothing more than that. No sound of a crash, no sense of shock, no jar that felt like one heavy body meeting another. The Titanic was being cut open by the iceberg, and yet no evidence that such a disaster had occurred. Consider the question of list alone. Here was this enormous vessel running starboard onto an iceberg, and a passenger sitting in bed felt no motion or list to the port side. And this must have been felt as if it had been more than the usual roll of the ship. So what he was saying, it's like if you bang into somebody, bang, you get knocked this way. So you think something like the mass of the Titanic, a huge mass, banging even slightly against another massive object would obviously swing to the side or tilt to the side. But he's saying, no, he never felt anything like that. No list at all. Sure, there were massive icebergs around, there were, but examples of ships being sunk by a collision with an iceberg are comparatively few and not of Titanic size. I don't know if any of you, like me, watched that series, Disasters in the Sea, something like that it's called anyway. And there was a recent story about a ship that was sunk by trying to cut through ice. And this was just as recently as 2007, but this was a small cruise ship with about 28 passengers on board, obviously paying vast amount of money to do this. But this ship had actually been built for cutting through Arctic ice, and down in the Antarctic, of course, was a bit different, really solid ice. So the thing just rammed into it and basically got a huge hole and sunk. Well, that was Antarctic ice, which is actually a lot thicker, more denser than ice in the Arctic. And this was a very small ship. So, I mean, there are the odd example, but not a ship of the size of the Titanic. Here's another eyewitness statement. Comes back to what I was talking about with the iceberg. My stateroom was an outside one. I was aroused by a sudden shock. I dressed hurriedly. I ascended to the boat deck. Found here one young lad. We strained our eyes to discover what had struck us. I sought the object, but in vain, for I swept the horizon near and far and discovered nothing. It was a beautiful night, cloudless, stars shining brightly, but no ice or iceberg was in sight. It did not occur to me it was an iceberg with whom we had collided. There somebody rushed up on deck, looked about, and where's this iceberg? And there are other eyewitnesses saying the same thing, So was it an iceberg? Okay. Now recently, there's been a whole load of things of people speculating, even on the internet, obviously, speculating, was it, as it were, attacked by an alien spaceship? Was it an utterly gigantic monster that suddenly came up? And I'm not suggesting anything like that at all. Come back to that. Yeah, so I'm not suggesting anything like that at all, but I will say some of the anomalies that occurred. Now, there were mystery lights spotted at this collision time. People saw lights in the distance. It wasn't the two ships who were involved yet, the California and the Carpathia. The two ships who were around who were involved. One involved came along and rescued. The California, I think, was the one that didn't bother coming to it. Which, I'm sure if you've watched any films or documentaries, you'll remember. But there were other lights, seen, which were called the mystery lights because they were never identified. It was never discovered whether this was another a ship or whatever it was. And another witness said that before the collision, they were looking down, not the side of the collision, they were looking down and they seen this, what looked like another object in the water, like a solid object, So, there were these other aspects to the collision which raises questions about what actually happened. And I'm not saying, I've got any answer to it. I did not claim, as I was accused of, saying that a UFO had sunk the Titanic. I didn't say, I made a good headline, but I didn't say that at all. All I said was, can we be sure that, it wasn't sunk by something else? And I will, all right. So the mystery's explained. I've just, gone over some peculiarities of some strange events. There's loads more. As I'm sure, there's been so many stories of sunken ships, which I'm sure, you've come across from time to time. But what kind of explanation can we consider? Underwater alien bases and civilizations? Well, there's been a lot of discussion over the years about where the UFOs, for example, come from. Where the USOs come from. Is there some civilization down there that we don't know, we've never discovered? Seems unlikely. But you get stories like this, again from the internet. In a document dating from 1982, a Russian Navy diver reported that he'd come across a group of humanoid creatures wearing silver suits at a depth of 50 meters, 150 feet, I think, in Lake Baikal. 3 divers chasing the creature were found dead. Well, of course, these kind of stories are just impossible to verify whether this actually happened or not. But again, it gives you an idea of the kind of stories that circulate, that there is, another world down there. There could be civilizations under the water that we don't know about. Is this where, some UFOs come from? People claim they've seen UFOs shooting out of the water. And there are reports even from around Scotland of, UFOs being seen in lochs. I've investigated that myself in the past. And, if you take into account these old stories about Atlantis, I know Atlantis was a civilization that was above water, allegedly, and which actually sunk beneath the waves. So it's always possible that this talk about UFOs and USOs and whatever strange creatures being seen underwater, have come from these stories of Atlantis. Obviously still in dispute about whether there was or was not an Atlantis. But if you see what can happen when you get massive flooding and rising seawaters, you do wonder, maybe there is some substance to it. And again, we get, a Garty land of advanced races, this idea, that there were advanced civilizations, there's still advanced civilizations. If you went underground, you'd find them. And these stories still circulate even today. So there's a long tradition of this kind of thing. But what about alien animals? Well, those are land animals, realise that. But, there could be, is there alien animals from, underground, under the water? Have these come from alien spaceships, or have they wandered in from other dimensions, and disappeared out of other dimensions? Does this actually explain what some of these sea monster sightings are about, or why they've occurred? How often do people see alien animals today? Yeah, well, actually, more often than you might think. You know, if you start looking at the literature about UFO, so on, encounters. So that's one possibility. Maybe you say it's a remote possibility, but you know, it's one possibility. Because, you know, you can talk about other dimensions. And at one time, this kind of thing would have been, you know, laughed about, and yeah, you know, it's all part of your imagination. Even today, some scientists are suggesting there could be other dimensions. Maybe our world interacts with other worlds, even with other universes. There could be multiple universes. So are we interacting with some of these? Does this explain some of these encounters? Does this explain why the Titanic or other ships or planes have sunk and disappeared? Or is it all down to our imagination? You know, imagination's a powerful thing. I quite agree. And there's no question about it. You know, you can imagine things, you can see things, you know, which look completely different when you get up close. I'm sure we've all had that experience of travelling along in a car, seeing something. God, is that, you know, what's that? Is that an elf or a gnome at the side of the road? You get up close and you find it's just a stone. It's something like that. Your imagination's powerful. And people do have these very strong dreams, and you sometimes wonder, well, what's happened? Somebody woken up and, you know, supposed to be on watch on a ship and think they've seen a monster, and actually they've seen nothing but projection of their imagination. Well, I will come to a close there. Probably got a minute or two left, but I will wind up. What I will say is that I didn't come, you know, here to convert anybody to this idea. But what's fascinated me is how real some of these incidents are to people. You know, there are people who convince themselves they've seen monsters. You know, and there's people who convince themselves there's something strange when there's nothing strange. But I do believe that strange things do happen to people. I do believe, you know, we can talk about the supernatural and the paranormal because of things that happen, if you like, out of the ordinary. Things that seem to defy our knowledge, our knowledge of the everyday world. I mean, the everyday reality that we come up against. I do believe that sometimes things happen that cannot be explained, and I would refer to simply as the supernatural. Thank you very much. Thank you.